Before we begin the story, leave a comment below indicating where you are. An elderly woman requests a glass of water on a flight. It seems harmless at first, but things rapidly escalate when the flight attendant refuses. 4 minutes later, she is fired on the spot. What transpired in those minutes changed everything. Starting today, if you found this story enjoyable, please subscribe for more. The plane had departed promptly, and the cabin was filled with the usual engine noise as passengers got into their seats, and the crew circulated the cabin, providing refreshments as the other passengers unwinded or attempted to slumber. Everything appeared to be running smoothly, until a seemingly insignificant incident, approximately 20 minutes into the flight, caused a domino effect of events that would culminate in a shocking conclusion. An elderly woman seated in the center row raised her hand. For the majority of the flight, she had been sitting quietly. However, now she appeared a bit uneasy. Her face had flushed slightly, and she appeared to be struggling to adjust the air vent above her seat. She caught the attention of a flight attendant, a young woman named Emily, who was walking down the aisle. The elderly woman apologized, but Emily paused briefly. She had been rushing from one passenger to the next, and it was evident that she had a lot on her plate. The flight was almost full. "Could I, please, have a glass of water?" Her voice was soft but clear. The flight was particularly hectic due to the high volume of requests, but an elderly woman asked for nothing fancy, just a glass of water. Emily glanced over at the woman, took stock of the bustling cabin, and then said, The elderly woman seemed perplexed and abruptly declined the offer of water, saying, "Sorry, but we're not serving it right now. Maybe in a few minutes." She then hurriedly left without waiting for a response. Although her response wasn't an outright refusal, it certainly didn't feel polite. A bit taken aback, she sank into her seat and attempted to relax, but the pain persisted. Her fidgeting hands fidgeted in her lap as she waited for the flight attendants to finish their rounds. After a few minutes, the woman, who was still thirsty, raised her hand again. This time, Emily was a little further away. Emily slowed her pace, evidently out of reluctance, as she made her way down the aisle to cross over to the woman. The elderly woman's request had been straightforward, but something about this moment appeared to throw her off. Emily's response this time was more forceful. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I really need some water." The elderly woman stared at her as she continued to perform her duties, clearly confused by what had just transpired. Had flown numerous times before and was familiar with the process, but today something seemed off. Feeling slightly irritated, she sat back in her seat. Passengers nearby overheard the exchange and began to exchange glances, with some appearing confused and others clearly at ease. Fortunately, the tension quickly subsided. The flight had taken an unexpected turn, but no one could have foreseen the consequences. Most passengers resumed their activities, but a handful exchanged glances, clearly sensing something was amiss. The old lady continued to look visibly uneasy as the flight progressed. She shifted in her seat, looking up at the flight attendants as they made their way around the cabin. Her throat was parched, and the heat from the vents above wasn't helping. No longer was it about the water. What mattered was the level of respect and care she had grown to expect from airline employees throughout the years. About half an hour later, Emily made her way down the aisle again, this time carrying a tray of beverages for other passengers. She passed the elderly woman, who might have been Emily, glanced down at the woman, her expression blank, as she called out to her once more, "Excuse me, but I really need that water right now." In response, the woman gave a flat, "I told you I can't get to you right now. You'll have to wait." She didn't even bother to explain or offer a polite response. It was as if she were. The other passengers started to notice, with some frowning and exchanging uncomfortable glances. But Emily didn't appear to notice the change in the atmosphere as she turned away from the woman. Her face flushed slightly, but not from anger, but from the humiliation of being ignored. swiftly and left, leaving the elderly woman to sit there, becoming increasingly uneasy as the minutes passed. The air was thick with tension, now subtle but noticeable. What had started as a harmless request had escalated into something much more serious. The woman had been turned down for water not once, but twice, and now she was beginning to feel like there was more to her request than simply a lack of it. The other passengers began to murmur amongst themselves, and the sense that something wasn't quite right was intensifying. As Emily continued, the whole cabin seemed to wait with bated breath, wondering how much longer this would go on. However, as the trip continued, the uneasiness in the cabin began to change. Emily's callous attitude was unwarranted, and what had been a little matter became an uncomfortable focal point for some passengers. Some began to whisper questions about why the elderly woman had been denied such a simple request, while others felt sympathy. For the woman who sat quietly trying to control her pain, approximately 10 minutes after the second rejection, the elderly woman pressed her call button again. This time, Emily was just a few rows away, so there was no way she could ignore the request. Time. But as the bell sounded, Emily glanced around the cabin and paused, her expression betraying her apparent anxiety and the fact that she was clearly struggling to deal with the scenario she had been evading. After what seemed like an eternity of tasks, she eventually made her way to the elderly lady's seat, yet there was an air of coldness about her. The woman glanced up, a hint of relief visible on her face. But that quickly passed as Emily confronted her. "I don't think you should keep asking for water," Emily said in a cold and dismissive tone. "You've already been told, and I won't repeat myself." Emily's words were direct and harsh, catching the elderly woman unaware. Nearby passengers visibly moved in their seats, startled by the abrupt shift in tone. A man a few rows ahead glanced back, his pupils narrowing as he attempted to make sense of what was happening. The cabin, which had previously been bustling with conversation, now appeared to be plagued by an uneasy stillness, as if everyone was anticipating an uncertain announcement. Uncertain of how to react to the mounting tension, the elderly woman, who was now experiencing more than just thirst, felt a surge of annoyance well up inside her. She had never anticipated being treated in such a manner, particularly on a flight she had taken numerous times. Instead of speaking out, Emily, on the other hand, appeared to be done with the interaction as she began to walk away. But as she did so, the elderly woman's voice broke the silence with a low but firm, "Please, I'm just asking for some water. Why are you unable to assist me?" Emily stood motionless in the middle of the plane, and for an instant it appeared as though everyone on board was holding their breath. However, rather than showing any empathy or acknowledgement, Emily let out a loud exhale and continued on her way. Word was the last straw. What had started out as a small argument had quickly grown into something much larger, and the tension was tangible among the passengers. Some shook their heads in bewilderment, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the midst of all this, the elderly woman had become the object of indifference, and the cabin began to sense that something much greater was about to happen as the flight progressed. Her request was straightforward. She wasn't seeking special treatment or demanding anything out of the ordinary. However, things seemed to be getting worse. The formerly collected old lady now appears plainly worried, with a pale face and clenched hands. Her pain is evidently mental as well as physical. The cabin remained still, but an air of dread pervaded it. A few of passengers began to whisper to one another, their eyes darting to the front of the aircraft. The subject had shifted from the water to the manner she had been handled. While working in pairs, the flight attendants started to feel a change in the air. One of them, a senior attendant called Laura, overheard Emily and the old lady having a conversation. Laura had been occupied with another row of passengers, but she caught the tail end of it when she finished her duties, stopped halfway down the aisle to observe Emily chatting with another attendant near the cockpit. Laura noticed that Emily wasn't acting normally. Even when pressured, she remains cool and collected. However, Emily appeared visibly anxious as she paced nervously, her expression betraying her anxiety. Laura silently made her way to the old lady's row, where she met her gaze and offered a slight bow of sympathy. The woman remained silent, but Laura could see that she was not at ease. "I'm sorry about the wait," Laura whispered softly. "Let me get you." While Laura made her way to the galley to get the water, she caught the attention of a few passengers who seemed to be staring in her direction. The old lady, who was too shocked to answer right once, nodded her head in agreement. Her voice was barely audible as she thanked her. The mood in the cabin had subtly changed. Some passengers appeared relieved, while others appeared uncertain of how to respond. The air was thick with tension, and Emily, who had been pacing near the front, started to notice that some passengers had taken sides. The passengers began to whisper about the incident, and Emily's eyes darted anxiously as she overheard them discussing her treatment of the elderly woman. Her stomach knotted as she realized the situation was rapidly getting out of her hands, but she chose not to intervene. The elderly woman took the glass, her hands trembling as she drank the water. Emily, who had attempted to ignore the tension in the hopes that it would go away, watched from a distance as Laura returned with the water, her face still showing a subtle expression of apology. It appeared for a second that things might calm down, but by then the damage had been done. The people around her were still observing, and the whispers persisted. What had begun as a minor slip-up was now becoming a major problem, and no one, least of all Emily, could turn a blind eye to it as the old woman. As she sipped the water, a wave of relief washed over her. Her hands became steady and her breathing became regular again. For a brief moment, it was as if the storm had passed. However, the fallout from their earlier exchange was far from over, and Emily remained steadfast by the galley as her returning to the cabin. She noticed that everyone's gaze was fixed on her. The problem had escalated from the elderly woman to the entire cabin. The tension had grown tangible, and even those who hadn't seen the previous exchange could sense that something was amiss. Emily attempted to shut out the world and concentrate on her responsibilities, but she couldn't disregard the whispers. The situation was becoming worse, and she could tell. Some people were obviously disturbed, whispering between themselves and even giving her disapproving looks. Emily knew that her actions had contributed significantly, but she chose to let her pride get the best of her instead of admitting that she might have handled the situation poorly. After all, it was only a minor slip-up, right? So she convinced herself that it wasn't a huge problem. But things became worse as the journey progressed. A few of people in the seats behind the old lady had observed her pain and discreetly asked if she was okay. It didn't take long for another flight attendant, Kelly, to step in and assess the situation. She had already been briefed about what had happened. An elderly woman, who was still unsure of how to react, nodded in agreement. Emily, who had been standing off to the side and appeared more worried, was approached by Kelly, who, upon hearing the murmur grow louder throughout the cabin, decided she would not stand by when passengers were upset or when things began to spiral out of control. Kelly shot Emily a piercing look that Emily felt a knot form in her stomach as she quickly spoke with Kelly, who was aware of the situation. In a quiet but forceful voice, she stated, "I need to speak with you." Emily had no clue what Kelly was about to say, but she knew it wouldn't be good. As they made their way to the plane's tail, Emily couldn't help but look around at the passengers, who had taken a remarkably silent approach. They could all tell that something was about to happen. When they arrived at the tail, Kelly looked at Emily with a mix of anger and shock, asking, "What on earth were you thinking?" "You can't treat passengers like that, especially someone who was asking for something as simple as water," she asked, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. Emily didn't respond right away. She opened her mouth to explain, but she couldn't find the words. She felt a cold sweat roll down her back. "It's not about being busy or stressed. You're here to help people. If you can't do that, then this job isn't for you." "Listen," Kelly continued calmly but firmly, and Emily could tell there were consequences on the horizon. Emily stood there silently as the gravity of the situation set in. She hesitated for a minute, giving her words time to sink in. By this point it was too late to apologize. What had begun as an innocent act of withholding water had escalated into something far worse. Emily felt the walls closing in on her as she grappled with the gravity of what Kelly had said. The passengers and her boss could sense the mounting tension in the back of the plane, and she knew things were about to explode. There was no turning back now that Kelly was staring at Emily the whole time she spoke. "Emily, you are serving more than just drinks. You are serving people. No matter what, you must remember that every passenger deserves respect, especially someone who is particularly difficult to deal with." The words lingered in the air, causing Emily's mind to race. She had a sneaking suspicion that something wasn't quite right with her handling of things, but she had convinced herself that she was simply trying to keep things running smoothly. However, now that Kelly was staring at her with her intense gaze, she couldn't ignore it. Emily eventually spoke out, her voice barely audible as she seemed to be addressing herself rather than Kelly. She had been so preoccupied that she hadn't realized how disastrous her actions had been. Kelly let out a little sigh, her visage gradually softening, but not with forgiveness. "Emily, the issue isn't with the water, but with your request handling skills. The question is, do you believe it's about empathy?" Emily felt her gut tighten as she realized she had failed to address the elderly woman's concerns. In her haste to complete multiple tasks, she had failed to see things from the woman's perspective, and now she wondered if it was fair to treat her so casually. Emily had completely disregarded her need for basic care, which is something that every passenger should be able to anticipate. I was unaware of the severity of the situation since Emily spoke in a barely audible whisper, leading me to believe that no one was paying attention. I was under the impression that it would go away on its own, but Kelly wasn't having any of it. She wasn't interested in hearing any rationalizations or excuses, and you, Emily, are more seasoned pilots than I am. It was extremely uncomfortable for Emily because she realized that everyone in the cabin had seen the rude treatment of a passenger. There had been a lot of whispering, snickering and looking back and forth, and it was all too much. It became more apparent that the whole aircraft had been impacted by the brief exchange between Emily and the old lady. Dissatisfaction extended beyond any one passenger who had watched the conversation, and Kelly's voice became increasingly, "It's not just the old lady, the other passengers are affected as well. You've made a spectacle by ignoring someone in need, which has made them feel uncomfortable. There was a better way to handle the situation, but now it's too late." Emily felt with every passing second the weight of those words and the reality of the situation begin to seep in. What started out as a little problem had escalated into a full-blown catastrophe, and it was her fault. She had failed to de-escalate the situation, exacerbated the situation for a brief period of time as they were silent. Kelly's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained stern. "You must return to the woman's side and make amends, but that won't be sufficient. I will remove you from the remaining this flight. You won't be able to help anyone else for the remainder of the journey." Emily's heart sank. She knew this was coming, but hearing it spoken landed like a blow to her gut. Not only had she messed up before, but now she was being kicked off the flight, which twisted her stomach with shame. The worst part wasn't even realizing she had disappointed her passengers and herself. Emily mumbled something under her breath. Her voice was trembling, and she couldn't find the words to express her feelings. Her hands were tightly clasped at her sides, and all she could think about was the consequences. About the old lady who was likely still hurting from being fired, and how the other passengers were passing judgment on her because of it. Kelly nodded, her face barely softening, and said, "I'll talk to the captain. You're not in trouble just yet, but this is serious. Take a seat." Emily felt a surge of guilt as Kelly turned to depart. She had failed to uphold her training and provide the passengers with the care they deserved. Now she had to confront the consequences of her actions, so she walked slowly toward the rear of the plane. As Emily made her way to the rear of the plane, her heart burdened by the weight of everything that had transpired. The remainder of the journey would be lengthy. With each step, the burden intensified. She could sense the scrutiny of her fellow passengers as she passed. It no longer felt like it was just the old woman she had harmed. It seemed like the cabin seemed to be evaluating her based on what had happened. She made it to the very last row and sat down, but the seat was strange and unpleasant. In rapid success, her mind raced over every minute of the journey, recreating each one. Feeling even worse than before, she had been trained for this job and knew all the proper protocols, etiquette and customer service standards. However, in that very moment, she had failed to follow through on a simple request, and a chain reaction had begun. Being unprepared, she hadn't anticipated the elderly woman's discomfort or her own coldness. Emily's thoughts were broken by the faint murmur of the people surrounding her. She could hear snippets of conversations, some of which included the other passengers' uneasiness, which all combined into a sour sensation that now weighed on her chest. The flight proceeded. Incident, theories about what might happen next, and the general unhappiness that had grown throughout the flight. It appeared as though every passenger had an opinion regarding what had happened. Some were critical of her actions, while others felt sorry for the old lady, but to Emily it made no difference. She had failed miserably. In the meantime, the old woman at the epicenter of the storm was sitting serenely in her chair, her glass of water empty after she drank it all in one long gulp. However, it was obvious that the problem extended beyond the simple requirement to stay hydrated. It was about a guy in his mid-30s, sitting a few rows away, had witnessed the woman's distress and was concerned about the lack of respect she had received when she had asked for help. The most hurtful element, however, was the fact that she had been treated with such apathy. Emily couldn't hear a word they said, but she saw the guy nodding in agreement as the lady talked, so she took it as a sign that he was trying to soothe the old woman's anxiety. Their body language made it clear that they were talking about the situation, but the man spoke to Emily with a quiet respect that Emily had failed to offer. Emily felt guilty about how fast the situation had escalated, and she hadn't had. In her haste to dismiss the old woman, she had unwittingly dismissed all of the other passengers who had witnessed the incident. As a result, the entire flight had taken on a new tone, and it wasn't only the passengers who had noticed Laura, the senior. The flight attendant who had stepped in to offer the woman water had also been observing the situation. She saw Emily retreat to the rear of the plane, appearing defeated. However, Laura was determined not to let this slide. She knew this wasn't an innocent mistake, but a complete breakdown in professionalism. She proceeded to the rear of the plane. Laura cautiously made her way toward Emily, who was seated in the very back of the plane. There was an air of quiet seriousness about her as she sat down next to Emily, who she had been eyeing with a stern expression. Steered clear of looking at the vacant seats across from her, Emily could feel Laura's intense scrutiny as she struggled to find the words to explain what had gone wrong. After a brief period of silence, Emily realized that everything had turned upside down. Every decision you make, no matter how big or small, affects people's lives, comfort, and sometimes even emotions. "Emily, I'm not trying to scold you. I know how stressful this job can be. What you need to realize is that you're dealing with more than just snacks and drinks." "Disturb someone." Emily fidgeted uneasily in her chair, and Laura's comments hit her more than she had anticipated. She had known this the whole time, but the stress of the job had clouded her judgment, and she hadn't stopped to consider the individual directly across from her or those who had been. As things were starting to come apart, Laura spoke in a calm but insistent tone, saying, "You need to reflect on how you want to move forward with this job and this responsibility. It requires a level of care. It's difficult to regain the trust that people have in us, but the part that hurts the most is when they remember how you made them feel." When Emily finally turned to look at Laura, she met her gaze for the first time and could see both disappointment and a hint of hope in Laura's eyes. "I didn't intend for it to turn out this way," but Emily spoke quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I know that Laura had learned how to handle those moments when she was under pressure, tired and overwhelmed, but Emily hadn't. Emily's choice became more apparent as the weight of her mistake grew heavier. It wasn't just about the impending firing. It was about how she had handled herself in that moment and how it had an impact on everyone around her, including the elderly woman and the others. The choice was hers to make. Learn from this or let it define you. It was a lengthy journey back, and not only because of the time, people, including Emily, were dealing with the fallout of her decision to let a little issue escalate into a major one. No matter the time or distance, Emily would never forget the lesson she had learned the hard way. As the airplane drew near its destination, she sat quietly in the final seat, staring at the cabin ahead of her. Her thoughts raced through every detail of the previous few hours. The once soothing sound of the engines now served as a continual reminder of the tension in the air. Every few minutes she would glance up, meeting the eyes of a few passengers, but she would swiftly avert her gaze as a wave of humiliation washed over her. It felt as though the entire plane was aware of what had transpired. The burden of their verdict was nearly too much to bear, and despite the muted complaints of a few passengers, the cabin had fallen into a restless stillness. The old woman, who had served as the catalyst for all that had gone wrong, was no longer the focus of attention. Her discomfort, which had been so apparent before, had subsided. Emily felt a pang of disappointment after getting the water she needed, but she knew it wouldn't go away soon. She had disappointed someone who needed kindness, and even more so, she had disappointed everyone who had witnessed her actions. Passengers who saw what happened would remember it, and those who had only heard whispers would recall the tales that Emily was well aware would circulate as they stepped off the aircraft. The cabin staff were aloof as well. Laura and Kelly hadn't spoken with her since their short encounter in the plane's rear, and Emily had discreetly taken her seat, too embarrassed to speak. Approaching neither of them, she stooped to make herself as small as possible, hoping that the passage of time would alleviate the pain of the situation. However, she was well aware that this would not be the case. At one point in the flight, the captain announced that they would be descending into Miami soon over the intercom, but his normally upbeat tone was missing. The more objective voice took its place, and Emily couldn't help but wonder if he was aware of what had transpired on the flight as well. Despite the announcement being made to mark the end of the journey, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this flight in particular would never feel finished to her. It was one thing to be criticized or the supervisor reprimanded Emily, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had been clearly visible to the passengers, many of whom she would never see again. As the flight drew to a close, Emily reflected on the larger picture, wondering how things had gone so wrong in that brief period. Time wasn't on her side. She was aware that she had always given her all to her work, but something had changed that day. Bound up in the routine and stressed out by work, she had failed to act with the basic decency that should have governed her. As the aircraft started to descend, Emily realized that being a flight attendant was about more than simply keeping passengers safe and providing them with refreshments. It was also about treating them with respect, compassion, and empathy. In the moment that counted most, she had failed to accomplish this. While getting ready for landing, she hurried in the hopes of avoiding any awkward passenger encounters. Nevertheless, the soothing sounds of the cabin and the plane's gradual descent served only to remind her of how badly she had bungled her seatbelt emergency. As soon as the signal came on, Emily stealthily made her way to the galley, her gaze fixed on the floor. She wasn't sure if it was the correct thing to do, but she felt compelled to take action in order to begin making amends. While she couldn't change the past, she hoped that by learning from her mistakes, she could at least demonstrate that she was taking them seriously. As Emily stood at the front of the galley, patiently awaiting Laura's final instructions, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she turned around to see an elderly woman standing behind her, her small frame slightly curved with age. Emily blinked in surprise, not expecting the woman to approach her at all. However, as she turned around, she noticed that the woman was actually standing on a stool. Her gut knotted up with guilt as she saw the compassionate look in the lady's eyes. "Excuse me," the old woman whispered, her voice firm and kind. "I just wanted to thank you for the water earlier. I know it was a bit of a hassle." Emily was about to say something, but nothing came out. She was expecting the lady to be furious or unhappy, but instead she was expressing thanks, which made this little gesture hurt even more. A selfless act of kindness occurred when Emily realized how horribly she had treated the lady. The woman's smile was warm, but Emily could see that it betrayed her suffering. Emily eventually spoke out, saying, "I'm so sorry for the way I treated you. I should have been more patient and understanding. You didn't deserve it." The old lady nodded, her grin wavering ever so slightly. "I know you were probably stressed," she whispered, her tone warm and comforting. "But people need compassion, even when they're not themselves." There was a brief period of stillness as Emily felt tears fill up in her eyes and said, "I failed you. I'm really sorry." Then the old lady reached out and gently put a hand on Emily's shoulder. With a kind touch on Emily's arm, the old lady reassured her, "It's all right, my dear." Her voice was filled with sympathy as she explained that everyone has difficult days, but that she hoped Emily would remember to be nicer the next time. With that, the woman turned and returned to her seat, leaving Emily standing there in shock. The elderly woman's forgiveness didn't erase Emily's mistake, but it reminded her that there was always room to do better. While she couldn't change the past, she could control her actions moving forward. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe she could begin to make things right. The plane arriving in Miami, Emily was well aware of the challenges that lay ahead. She had probably lost her job and had her reputation tarnished among passengers and co-workers. However, she did have one guiding principle, that no matter how bad things got, there was always an opportunity for improvement. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but passengers started to unbuckle and gather their belongings as the plane touched down in Miami. However, for Emily, the end of the flight didn't bring relief. Instead, it intensified the pressure she had been experiencing all day. She was determined to learn from her mistakes, no matter the cost. Passengers started to disembark one by one, and she watched as they went. Their expressions were a constant reminder of what had happened. She desperately wanted to avoid seeing Kelly or Laura, but she knew she couldn't live in denial about the enormity of her mistake. As the other passengers disembarked, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. When the crew members completed their tasks and were ready to exit the aircraft, Emily remained behind in the cabin, which was almost empty. Suddenly, Kelly came charging over, her footsteps resonating in the now quiet area. Emily straightened up, her pulse racing. She had been dreading this confrontation, which was certain to happen. Conversations around the incident and its aftermath consumed her thoughts. Uncertainty over Kelly's reaction made her realize that the situation would not be simple. Kelly stood with her arms crossed, her facial expressionless, and Emily was unable to decipher her expression for a while. As if there were no one else on the plane except for Emily, the silence that ensued as the flight attendants chatted and the plane's final preparations sounded like a wall of tension. At last, Kelly broke the silence, saying, "I've already had after discussing the matter with the captain, it will be necessary to notify the airline about this incident." Emily silently nodded in agreement, as she had anticipated this, but hearing it spoken out made it feel even more real. Kelly paused, allowing the statement to sink in. She appeared calm, but her harsh edge ran through Emily's voice as she said, "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. What you did today was unacceptable." The way she handled the passenger was more than an accident. It was a failure in the most fundamental aspect of her job. My stomach dropped with every word. I wanted to defend myself by explaining how overwhelmed I had been and how it had gotten out of hand, but I couldn't find the right words. The truth was that I had failed to act with the compassion and professionalism that were her strengths. Emily choked on her emotions as Kelly continued, "I don't know what was going through your head, but I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've seen how quickly things can go wrong, but I've also seen how small acts of kindness can turn a situation around." Kelly had an opportunity to fix the situation, but instead, she made it worse. "I don't expect you to have all the answers right now," Kelly continued, her voice softening slightly, "but you've got to understand how serious this is." Despite her best efforts, every word stung like a needle, reminding her of how far she had missed the mark. This goes beyond that one woman. It affects everyone who relies on airlines for a sense of security and comfort when traveling, and you failed to deliver that today. Emily felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, but she refused to turn away. She had to face the music and accept responsibility, no matter how difficult it was. Kelly took a deep breath, and her breath caught as she leaned against the kitchen counter and gave Emily a firm stare. "I won't say this is the end of your career path, but you need to really consider how you do this work moving forward. It's not enough to just obey the rules. You must also comprehend that duty entails." Kelly spoke more softly after a brief pause. "Now, if you wish to remain employed here, you must demonstrate that you can draw lessons from this, not only to us, but also to the passengers. There is much to be done, but it begins with accepting this responsibility." Responsibility. Emily's heart ached, but she understood that Kelly was correct. Admitting fault was the first step. Now she needed to demonstrate that she could improve. After Kelly watched her for a second, she nodded and said, "I'm going to report." As Kelly departed, leaving Emily standing alone in the galley, a whirlwind of emotions washed over her. It wasn't relief, no, there was no relief yet. It was, she suddenly realized that her actions had impacted more than just the elderly woman. They had altered her entire perspective on the job. In her haste to get things done, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. Making sure passengers felt cared for, had forgotten that, and the results were obvious. Yet a glimmer of hope lingered. She could still make a difference, and if the airline offered her another chance, she would use it to her fullest advantage to demonstrate that she could improve. She understood that she still had a long way to go, but she had made some progress. Emily stood near the galley, gazing out the window at the brilliant Miami skyline as the last people disembarked from the aircraft. She had no idea what was ahead of her. She had no idea if she would be asked to quit her work or not. She drew a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and began to walk toward the front of the plane. The day was far from over, but at least she would never forget how it had shaken her to her very core. It had also reminded her of the importance of humility and kindness in every part of her life, not just at work. At least she knew where to go from here. The following hours seemed to go on forever for Emily as the crew disembarked. She stood in the nearly deserted terminal, gazing at her reflection in the airport gate. The noise inside her head had subsided, but she could still hear it. Was so loud that it could be heard over and over again as she relived every moment of the journey, including the unease of the old lady, Emily's frigid dismissal of her, the other passengers' quiet judgment, and, of course, Kelly's resounding comments. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a person who had made a huge error, an error that had impacted more than one passenger, and that would linger in her thoughts for days to come. Even though she was still wearing her uniform, she felt like she was wearing a badge of failure. The captain had talked to her before the disembarkation, providing some advice. He hadn't been furious, just dissatisfied. He had stressed how her negligence had escalated a simple request for water into a disaster. It was important to remain calm in stressful situations. "You're here to preserve the peace, Emily," he had said. "The rest could be handled, but it was with people that we really made an impression." His words were gentler than Kelly's, but the meaning was the same. Had even inquired about her well-being. "It's easy to let things slip," he added, "but what matters is what you do next." Emily stood in the terminal, feeling small, alone, and disconnected, haunted by those words. Now, what should I do? Based on everything she had seen and heard, she knew that the airline's upper management would decide her fate. She had no idea how they would perceive her actions, whether as a small slip-up or something more serious, and she had no idea how much sway her past experiences would have in their decision-making process. All she could do was wait. Feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her uncertainty, she made her way out of the gate area and into the employee break room, where she hoped to find solace and distraction. She wasn't sure why she thought this would help, but she figured that no one there could possibly comprehend the struggle she had endured today. Had witnessed the incident directly, and Emily was sick of trying to explain or justify her actions, so she took a seat by the window and stared out at the planes sitting on the runway. The airport noise seemed far away, as if she were in another world, and her actions seemed out of place. "Are you holding up okay?" The senior flight attendant questioned Laura in a measured but not harsh tone as she approached her silently, without the customary enthusiasm. "I'm not here to reprimand Emily further," she said. "I believe I screwed up, really messed up," Emily remarked after a moment, her voice barely audible. Laura sat down next to her, her presence calm and collected. Emily gazed down at her hands, which were on the table. Her uniform seemed tighter, almost stifling. Laura's words hit Emily harder than anything else she had heard today. She had spent so much time blaming herself and trying to make sense of what went wrong that she hadn't really taken the time to think about what to do next. Emily stated it again, this time with a tinge of annoyance. "I simply don't know how to fix it." Laura folded her arms and sat back in her chair, seemingly overwhelmed by the seemingly easy query. Emily nodded slowly, but her mind was still racing. She had no clue what the airline's ultimate decision would be. "You can start by demonstrating that you're ready to learn, which would benefit both us and the people you're serving," Laura remarked, almost reading her thoughts. "You've got another chance, but you have to prove you can." She couldn't let this moment to define her forever. She wasn't the same person she had been before the airplane took off. Deal with it, come prepared, ask for criticism, and most importantly, own up to your mistakes. After you do that, everything else will fall into place. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the burden of her error weigh heavily on her shoulders. But as she absorbed Laura got to her feet after a lengthy period of stillness and said, "Don't be so hard on yourself. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do with them." Before Laura departed, Emily felt a faint sensation, hopefully only a flicker, something she hadn't felt in hours. It was a comforting gesture that reminded her that she had the strength to overcome any obstacle. Sitting there for a while longer, she allowed the words to sink in. Perhaps it wouldn't be easy. Perhaps the road ahead would be filled with more challenges and moments of self-doubt, but there was still a chance for redemption if she was willing to face the hard truth and put in the work. She knew she had to face it, and as she watched the planes get ready for takeoff, she had a realization. This was her journey too, a path of self-discovery and improvement. By the time the phone call arrived later that afternoon, she would be prepared. Ready to tackle whatever came next, Emily's phone rang earlier than she had anticipated. It was mid-afternoon, and she was still in the break room, deep in thought. As the name of the airline's HR representative flashed across the screen, her heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. She took a deep breath and answered, "Hello, Emily. This is Karen from Human Resources. I'm following up regarding the..." The call had been something she had been dreading since getting off the airport, and now that it had arrived, the reality of it seemed even more acute. Emily's thoughts raced as she battled to keep her voice calm, acknowledging that she was aware of what had transpired. Karen's voice, albeit professional, conveyed an undeniable tone of worry. It was evident that Karen had already been informed on the issue. "I want you to know that the airline has reviewed the matter, talked to your managers and some of the customers who were on board today, and that I've been thinking about it all day." There was a pause as the other person spoke. "And I get it, Emily. You should know," Karen continued, "we're committed to giving our staff the opportunity to improve, especially when there's a clear willingness to learn and grow based on your reflection and the conversations we've had with your team." Emily felt her stomach drop. She knew this was coming, but hearing it now made everything feel so much more real. "We've decided not to terminate your employment." The words slammed into Emily's head, but she didn't feel relief right away. Rather, she experienced a mixture of gratitude and shame, as if she had been given a second chance that she didn't truly deserve. Karen added firmly that there are a few matters that must be attended to prior to your return to the schedule. Extra training sessions will be necessary, with an emphasis on customer service, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence. Additionally, you will be observing senior staff for a period to guarantee that you are putting these principles into practice. Emily nodded in agreement, despite Karen's best efforts to discourage her. "I'm relieved to hear that you're prepared to do whatever it takes to make things right, and I applaud your admission of fault and commitment to doing so. But please grasp the gravity of the situation. This is a pivotal moment, for you should expect a more severe treatment of your career here if this sort of conduct persists." "I get it." Emily raised her voice more steadily. "I will not allow this to happen again. As Karen said, you will get an email from me shortly with the details of the further training. We will be in touch from time to time, and we hope you'll take this opportunity to reflect on the significance of your work and its effect on passengers." At this point, the line fell silent and Karen's voice came back up, but with a gentler tone. "Chance, because we see promise in you, but how seriously you use this opportunity is entirely up to you." After the conversation ended, Emily sat for a while, her hand trembling slightly as she wondered what had happened. Anticipated the worst from the call, so hearing that her job wasn't completely out of the question was almost surreal. Instead, she was being offered a chance to prove herself, which sent a flood of mixed emotions coursing through her. On one hand, she was relieved, thinking, "At least I still have a job." On the other hand, despite the weight of the new responsibility, Emily knew she had to work even harder than before to prove she could regain the trust of her supervisors, co-workers, and most importantly, the passengers. This wasn't a fresh start, but a warning. Unsteady on her feet, she made her way to the break room window to watch the planes take off. As the sun started to set, it cast a golden glow over the tarmac, and for a brief moment, she felt as though she was viewing the world through a different lens. At that moment, she realized her mistake. There was still work to be done, but it felt less daunting now that she had the opportunity to rebuild and make changes. The weight of her failure hadn't gone, but it wasn't as overwhelming either. She wasn't going to let this mistake define her. She had learned from her mistakes. Today, she gained invaluable knowledge. She realized that empathy and professionalism were not mere platitudes, but rather the bedrock of her job. Without these, her other responsibilities as a flight attendant would have been meaningless. Her role encompassed much more than just serving drinks and following procedures. It was all about building relationships and treating each passenger with kindness and consideration, no matter what. Emily was determined to improve, but she knew it wouldn't happen quickly. She also knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with doubt, challenges, and plenty of opportunities for mistakes. As she left the break room, the noise of the airport seemed less like a backdrop to the day she had been given a second chance, and more like the beginning of a new chapter in her life, even though the people she had harmed that day would never forget how she treated them. Opportunity, and she was determined not to waste it. She vowed to herself that the next flight she worked would be different. What followed was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, long hours and difficult training sessions as Emily immersed herself into her profession. Go headfirst into her job, hell-bent on not letting the second opportunity she'd been granted pass her by. It wasn't easy. Every minute she'd time at work suddenly seemed like an exam, an opportunity to demonstrate to her co-workers, her superiors, and most importantly herself, that she was capable of growing from her failures. The extra training sessions were challenging. They went over all the material she had previously assumed, down to the subtleties of serving customers effectively, the value of attentive listening and coping with pressure without compromising performance. Regarding the passengers, Emily had difficulty with some of the tasks, particularly the simulated settings in which she was required to calm down volatile individuals. Felt as if she needed to relearn every muscle memory associated with her former method, constantly reminding herself that it wasn't just about finding solutions. It was also about ensuring that travelers felt valued and heard. She also got the opportunity to observe top flight attendants throughout these sessions, including a Jessica, who had been an employee of the airline for more than 10 years, took her under her wing. Jessica exemplified the qualities that Emily sought in a role model, a calm, collected, sympathetic, and capable individual. Reduce stress using just soothing language and a kind smile, it became abundantly obvious that Jessica really grasped the importance of treating travelers as individuals, rather than just another number on a daily basis. As they waited to board a flight, Jessica advised her, "You can't carry yesterday with you. The travel was a fresh chance. You should fix yourself up if you make a mistake, but you shouldn't let it define you." Nodding and taking in her remarks, Emily was about to accompany her on the following aircraft, when how could she possibly avoid letting her previous mistakes haunt her? How could she ever put the past in the past? Thinking about the passengers who had seen her fall, she recalled the old lady who left a lasting impression on her, and how her failure had affected her, had impacted more than only that instant, yet the words said by Jessica resounded in her. The idea that every flight presents a fresh chance to seize became Emily's mantra. Recognizing the past, drawing lessons from it, and embracing the future were more important than trying to erase the past. 2 weeks after the event, she was given her first actual exam, which helped her develop a more positive outlook. Regular journey from Miami to Chicago, the plane was quite empty, and as usual there was a flurry of activity as guests boarded, including the customary demands for. During the trip, Emily remained oblivious to the usual fare of beverages, snacks, and conversation. Responsibilities, intent on putting her expertise to use halfway through the trip, with a sudden gesture, an old lady on the aisle seat caught Emily's attention. The memory exam had arrived sooner than she had anticipated, yet there it was. She quickly dismissed the thought of the old lady from her last trip, since this was very different. Changed, and now Emily walked carefully toward the lady, allowing herself plenty of time to. She centered herself and said, "How may I be of service to you today, ma'am?" in a calm yet kind manner. I could see the relief on the face of the old lady as she looked up at her with a grin. Emily's voice was kind but distinct as she pleaded for a drink of water. Yet the request was straightforward, but burdened with the memories of her past. This time she hesitated not. With a swift motion, she turned and strode over to the galley where she promptly delivered the requested item. Emily paused to take it all in. This wasn't only about the water request. It was about everything. Now was her opportunity to show how much she had grown, and what she had taken away from her experience. Swiftly refilled the woman's water bottle and smiled as she gave it to her. "Here you go, ma'am. Please let me know if you need anything else." Emily continued on, her pulse pounding as the lady nodded in gratitude. The remainder of the trip went off without a hitch, but at that instant I felt a surge of pride rather than shame. Even something as basic as asking for water marked a major achievement for her. It wasn't just about bringing the water, it was about her composed demeanor in the face of adversity. Competently, and for the first time in weeks, free from the burden of her previous error, she experienced a sense of, with each subsequent flight, Emily made progress toward her goal. She continued to expand on that experience by offering the same level of service to each new guest, regardless of how they arrived. Approach her return to work cautiously, showing tolerance and understanding as she worked through the anxieties that had been plaguing her earlier. Faded. She wasn't flawless, and she anticipated more challenges. Still, she was acquiring the skills to deal with problems in a different way. Yet, confronting her co-workers was a particularly challenging aspect of her rehabilitation. Emily was everyone's perception of her changed after the occurrence. The passengers weren't the only ones who observed the disaster, though the whole crew had seen her at her weakest. Now it was her turn to prove her worth. Occasionally, there would be peaceful moments, such as when Emily saw that some of the more seasoned crew members were giving her curious looks. As time went on, her self-assurance increased. She wasn't hoping for praise or immediate affirmation, but she noticed a change when a couple of the senior attendants started to ask her questions in a manner that resembled utmost professionalism was required of all parties involved. The focus had shifted from the passengers to her. Connection with the group, Jessica approached Emily in the afternoon after a very uneventful flight. While Emily completed reviewing her notes for her next shift, Jessica appeared out of nowhere. "The door is open, and you're doing well," Jessica added in a tone that was both kind and clear. "Being a flyer with you for the last several trips, I can tell you've been practicing hard, and it shows." Jessica was a no-nonsense person, so Emily was taken aback by the compliment, which made her blink in astonishment. Emily had come to like her direct style, so when she said, "Thank you," Emily's voice sounded like a little gentler than what I've been attempting. Jessica agreed, "And I should simply maintain that outlook. Keep in mind that the people, not the work, are the most important part of your experience. You are capable of doing the job." Emily had a profound feeling of relief, her first since the tragedy, since no one could make her forget that she still had a ways to go. But this seemed like a reward for all her efforts to win Jessica's favor. Insignificant, she understood that the true challenge persisted. There will come a time when Emily would have to demonstrate that she had learnt, but for the time being sensed that she was making progress, but that the path ahead would be difficult and fraught with obstacles. However, after a lengthy period of pessimism, Emily finally felt optimistic about her future. Had erred, but she had also chosen to get beyond it and take anything away from it and go on with her job while demonstrating the empathy and respect required of her required. And she was certain that by producing a superior version, she was meeting that need. Imagines herself as someone who refuses to be defined by her errors of the past, instead choosing to encourage her development. The following month was a watershed moment in Emily's professional journey. Along with her life, the error she had committed, the shame she had endured, and the remorse that had engulfed her had shifted to the background as a renewed feeling of purpose took their place. She had persevered through every difficulty, blunder and moment, learning from each one, of uncertainty, but the time it took to get back on my feet wasn't the most important thing. Because she had repeatedly picked herself up, her self-assurance had steadily made a comeback. But this time, her self-assurance wasn't quite up to par, was unique. It wasn't founded on arrogance or a feeling of superiority. Rather, it was the self-assurance that comes from understanding the significance of being humble, the worth of listening, and the potential of Emily had learned that her skills as a flight attendant were more about empathy than about serving beverages or managing a boarding procedure. It was her people skills that allowed her to listen to others and provide being compassionate when it counted most, keeping cool under pressure, and, most importantly, always remembering that everyone aboard that flight had a tale that needed to be heard one day. Not long after her first yesterday, Emily was scheduled to go to Los Angeles on a long-haul flight. While this wasn't her first lengthy trip since her return, the accomplishment that the journey's lengthy duration bestowed upon her chance to pause, contemplate, and take stock of her progress while the jet glided along at an altitude of 35,000 feet. She was in the galley, getting a drink cart ready when the passenger drew near, a man in his mid-50s with well-groomed but somewhat exhausted features, bloodshot eyes, and the kind of such behavior that betrayed his exhaustion following a lengthy business trip or any other exhausting experience, pardon me. But might I perhaps have a glass of what the guy stated in a rather hoarse voice? A modest success, even in his humble plea, brought a smile to Emily's face as she beamed at him. It wasn't the request itself that was noteworthy, rather her attitude was. Swiftly, she extended a glass of water, her grin genuine, and said, "Of course, sir. Here it is." The guy gave her a puzzled glance before his expression was one of little exhaustion as he thanked her, adding almost as an afterthought, "You know. Flight attendants usually simply go through the motions," so Emily stopped when she got a pleasant answer. She shrugged slightly, explaining that she was taken aback by the statement for a second before trying to make it more personal. "Ultimately, we're all here for the same thing, aren't we?" He nodded, his expression softening. "It's true that we tend to get preoccupied with our own lives, but it's comforting to know that there is someone out there." It was a little remark, yet it had a profound impact on her. Anything, it brought back the reason she was here, to interact with people and serve them, not just as a server. She turned to leave, hoping to inject some compassion into what is otherwise a cold and impersonal encounter. Jessica, a senior flight attendant, was observing her from the galley when she caught sight of a familiar face. Doorway Jessica remained silent, but she did give a little nod to indicate her agreement. Even though it was little, Emily's pride caused her chest to constrict. It was an indication that her hard effort had paid off. The remainder of the journey went by without situation, and by the time they were getting ready to touch down in Los Angeles, Emily had a tranquility she hadn't felt in the last several months. She had confronted her internal and external obstacles and gained valuable knowledge. She had to learn the hard way, but her current passengers were blind to her past blunders. encountered a somebody who shown genuine concern for their journey, and that alone sufficed. Emily, being the last passenger off the aircraft, waited near the galley after landing to see whether the staff would leave. Stepped off the aircraft, she paused to gaze out the window, where the vibrant lights of Los Angeles danced under her feet. A sense of potential, and after a lengthy period of feeling like she had, once she collected her belongings and disembarked from the aircraft among her other crew members, she had the ability to mold her destiny. Kelly, her supervisor who had been at her side during her recovery, seemed to be, "She told you to just keep it," if she was reading Emily's mind. "You did good today." Emily nodded, her heart pounding with a newfound sense of urgency after she had moved on from seeking approval and praise to valuing the work, dedication, and understanding that she was maturing into her ideal self, but that her journey was far from over. Despite the fact that Emily had come to terms with the fact that her errors had been, she realized that her errors didn't define her, but rather they taught her and were a part of her journey, not her goal. To her, the essence of humanity, which she could thereafter impart to each and every customer she assisted. She began each meeting as a person who had erred, someone who let her emotions get the best of her on that journey, but she was departing, knowing the importance of tolerance, compassion, and the impact of a single act of generosity. Being an effective flight attendant, she had discovered, was about more than just getting the job done. It was about making feelings were shared by others she knew as Emily and the rest of the team made their way to the terminal. Though there was much more to discover, she now felt prepared for whatever lay ahead, since she was no longer limited by. She was characterized by the lessons she learned and the triumphs she achieved as a result of her failures in the past. And if you thought the video was good, please hit the like button and share it with others. Share your views below and hit that subscribe button for more content just like this.